Okay, look, thanks, Joe, for that. And thanks for the invitation from CCSE to come and speak again tonight. It's appreciated. Thanks to Joe, to Katie and to Kim for putting in the shift to organise this event. I know these things don't just kind of come out of thin air, so that's appreciated. Of course, thanks to you for coming out and spending a couple of hours to hear and think and talk about Grenfell, which is clearly one of the kind of key atrocities of our age, of our generation. This image, of course, is kind of based upon the Three Billboards film. This was a 6-month anniversary, 14th of December, towers in the background, 71 dead, still no arrests. Why not? In fact, about a month later, the 72nd victim of Hillsborough died in hospital. She'd gone into hospital with major burns, never came out. But I'll come back to talk about the physical injuries in a bit. I'm going to talk about three kinds of things unevenly, actually. I'm going to say something about Grenfell as a site of crime, a place where crime did happen and a place where crime might have happened, and just say what I think that means. Then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about Grenfell as a source of harm and document some of the harms that have been produced by the fire. And then I'm going to say something about, I've churned truth, justice and accountability around it, so there's truth, accountability and justice, because that's the order in which I'm going to talk about these things. I've given versions of this talk since the first version I gave was about 2 weeks after the fire, and I've given probably 25 versions of this talk in different parts of the UK, and outside the UK actually, including several in Liverpool. If you've heard this before, tough shit. The facts are the facts, right? The truth's the truth. But each time there are some slightly different things to say, and so I hope that if you have heard some version of this before, that there will be something that's still of interest, or something that you can argue with, or contest, or maybe even agree with. So, Grenfell is a site of crime. The first thing to say is that we know that there have been some criminal offences associated with Grenfell, and the criminal justice system has shown its usual efficiency in rounding up the usual suspects. These are the names of people who've been prosecuted for Grenfell-related offences. The first prosecution was within 2 weeks of the fire. The last one that I know about here is July 2018. Most of these are for fraud. In other words, people claiming that they lost possessions or in fact mostly loved ones in the fire when that didn't happen, in order to gain some kind of monetary gain. Most of these people have been imprisoned, with a couple of exceptions. The longest sentence was for 4.5 years. The ones that weren't for fraud, Amigo and Waikambo pleaded guilty to 2 counts of sending a public communications network, of sending by a public communications network and offending indecent or obscene matter. They were photographs of dead bodies in the tower on the night. He was jailed for 12 weeks. Rhys Morris wasn't fraud. Rhys Morris, when the cops were going through the flats, they found that he'd been growing weed in his flat, so he got done for that. He didn't go to jail, actually. He was various financial. No, sorry, that was Eamon Zada. Sorry, who was growing weed. He was given a prison sentence. Sorry, and the other person who was not sent to prison, and it wasn't fraud, was a guy called Rhys Morris. He lost a family member in the fire, and he shouted at the deputy leader of the council in a public meeting, and he was arrested for using threatening words or behaviour with intent to cause fear or provoke unlawful violence. He was given 12-month 100 hours of community service and various kind of financial penalties. So the criminal justice system has moved quickly to deal with what I call the usual suspects. If you look at images of these people, one of the things that's immediately apparent is none of them are white, by the way. So the criminal justice system is doing what the criminal justice system does very well in respect of these people. Where the criminal justice system is moving much more slowly, of course, is with the real culprits, or the potential culprits, the people and organisations who produce the fire, and that's with the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, the borough in which Grenfell Tower stood, Kensington and Chelsea Tenants Management Organisation, the arm's length kind of neoliberal social housing body set up by the council to manage its 11,000 social housing tenants in the borough, and also Ryden, who was the lead contractor on the refurbishment of the tower. which ultimately generated the danger in terms of some of the pipe work and also cladding on, and some of the other main subcontractors that who work with Ryden. Within a month, I think, or 6 weeks of the fire, the Metropolitan Police, or Cressida Dick, announced that the Met will be gathering evidence for possible charges of corporate manslaughter and corporate homicide under the 2007 law against at least these three corporate bodies. It then became apparent, I don't think it's public knowledge, but it then became apparent that by about Christmas, by December 2017, the Metropolitan Police had about 30 million documents to work through in order to process those charges. By Christmas, it had worked through about 100,000 of those. Cressida Dick says she didn't expect any charges to be laid until at least 2019, and it'd probably be 2020, 2021 before any decision, any kind of cases are passed towards the CPS. So there may or may not be charges of these corporate bodies. The Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act, to be clear, doesn't allow for, in fact, explicitly rules out prosecution of individuals. So no senior individuals in the council, the TMO, or the private contractors will be prosecuted under the Act because they can't be expressly ruled out. If there is a successful prosecution under the Act, the only sanction that can follow is a fine. The largest fine so far under the Act, there have been 24 successful prosecutions. Since 2007, the largest fine so far is £600,000. Of course, there is a problem in terms of fining a public body, because if you fine a public body like a council, the only income really a council has is its council tax. So the people who pay the fine are the council taxpayers. The people who and the result of that will be the council tax will go up, or services will go down, and the people who will be hardest hit are the people with least money in the borough, or the people who rely most upon the services, particularly exactly the kinds of people who were killed in Grenfell Tower on the night of, or the morning of June the 14th. So I'll come back to that point in a moment, but the kind of fine aspect of the Corporate Manslaughter Act is problematic. There may be health and safety prosecutions. There may be prosecutions under fire safety legislation. They're almost certain, I imagine. Again, what will follow will be fines, and again they will hit the most vulnerable in the borough the hardest. If there are criminal prosecutions, will that generate justice? Well, it will in one sense, this is the way that legal accountability works in our system. This is what the Corporate Manslaughter Act exists to do. This is what health and safety and fire safety legislation partly exists to do, which is to hold the guilty to account. The guilty will be organisations, not individuals, nor will it be policy makers, of course, but those people who oversaw deregulation of building regs, for example, which helped to produce the fire. Of course, if there are prosecutions, they'll generate fine, and that won't generate justice. It will generate injustices because the most vulnerable will be hurt, as I already said. But in any case, whether or not there are prosecutions, there'll be a complete irrelevance in the context of the searing harms which have been produced by the fire, with which people in and around the tower will live for the rest of their lives. And it's those harms upon which I want to focus for the most part in this talk. I'm going to talk about harms in kind of 5 broad categories. Clearly, these are kind of analytical categories. They're separated out for the sake of talking about them. In real life, people experience a multitude of these harms in combination. And in real life, these harms are also synergistic. So physical harms can also produce further emotional harms. And so these aren't isolated things, although for want of presentation and discussion, I'm going to talk about them one by one separately, so to speak. I'd also say that these harms, some of these harms, and indeed some aspects of some of these harms are much more manifest than others. Some we kind of know they exist, but their scale, their quantity, their effects actually are unknowable, and I'll come to some of those in a moment. But I think we have to recognise that all of these harms were produced by the fire on the 14th of June in 2017. So the first set of harms are in a way the most straightforward ones. They are the physical harms associated with what happened on that morning in the fire. Without being dismissive or crass, the most manifest physical harms, the ones that we clearly know about and can count, although there's still controversy over the numbers of people who were killed. But the official figure is 72 deaths, and that's the figure that we go with. 72 people lost their lives as a result of the fire. There were also people who sustained injuries, some of which will change people's lives, others of which people will recover from. The injuries mostly weren't burns because the fire was so intense that anybody who came into contact with the fire and was burnt was killed. So most of the injuries were associated with trying to get out of the building in the smoke and the shit and the dark and tripping over bodies. So there were kind of fractures of limbs and cuts and injuries to the head and concussions and so on. There were other. So the injuries also are kind of fairly manifest, fairly easy to kind of document. They're kind of physical. They're there. There were various manifestations of ill health produced by the fire. Obviously, many people suffered from smoke inhalation, and that will cause those people at certain points in their lives long-term respiratory problems with breathing, lung problems, and so on and so forth, damage to the linings of their lungs. Hydrogen cyanide, which was hydrogen cyanide was also an ingredient, not the right word, but I mean I'm not a chemist, right? But there's also an element of a chemical war agent which is now banned. But hydrogen cyanide, and the clues in the word cyanide, right, which is pretty fucking dangerous, right? Hydrogen cyanide was given off by the cladding, and it was a cause of death of about a dozen of the people who died in the tower that night. Many other people were exposed to hydrogen cyanide who didn't die, of course, and long-term health effects from exposure to hydrogen cyanide include respiratory disease, damage to the nervous system, and damage to the heart and coronary heart disease. So people will have their life shortened and have their lives made worse. We don't know about those people. Those effects won't be tracked. There'll be no tracking of those effects. We won't know how many lives are shortened by those exposures. Similarly, we also know that people were exposed to asbestos that night. Given the age of the tower, asbestos was in Grenfell, was built into the tower. Asbestos is a flame retardant. The heat was so intense that the asbestos broke down. That meant asbestos fibres were released into the atmosphere across the Lancaster West estate in which Grenfell Tower sat. Public Health England denied that was the case. They set up a monitoring point a week after the fire. A week after the fire, the monitoring point was 3/4 of a mile from the tower, and they said they didn't detect any unusual levels of asbestos in the airborne atmosphere. In September of this year, this year just gone, so over a year after the fire, Public Health England have finally accepted that they may have to monitor people living in the area for exposure to asbestos. That's kind of something, but it's not really much of a help, because if people have been exposed to asbestos and they do have early stages of mesothelioma, that's a fatal cancer caused only by exposure to asbestos, they'll die. They may die in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, 30 years, but it's incurable, okay? So they can monitor all they want, but people will die and we'll never know who those people are. And they'll die gruesome deaths, because people who die of mesothelioma die a very nasty death. The other physical harms associated with what happened that night is that those people with existing health problems will likely have their health problems exacerbated certainly by the relocation, by being relocated away, moved to other parts of the borough, moved out of the borough to other parts of London. But the main thing is having to stay for periods of time in bed and breakfast or hotel accommodation. So I'll come back to this in a bit, but the people who lived in the tower, according to the government's index of multiple deprivation, were, in general, the population of the tower were amongst the 10% most deprived in England. And we also know there are various illnesses associated with deprivation, and they include things like type 2 diabetes, high levels of cholesterol, chronic heart disease, and also high levels of childhood obesity. And all of those conditions can be mitigated or managed to some extent by control over diet, particularly salt and sugar intake. And of course, control over diet, including salt and sugar intake, is the one thing you can't exercise when you're in a fucking bed and breakfast or a hotel and your meals are being cooked for you, right? You can't exercise that control. Therefore, those health problems will have been exacerbated by being moved into temporary accommodation. The other obvious exacerbation of health problems are those people who had alcohol or drug dependency, for example, are likely to become more dependent upon alcohol and drugs in the immediate aftermath of the fire for very obvious reasons. A second set of harms produced by the fire, and again these are fairly obvious, are emotional and psychological harms. I'm not a mental health specialist, of course, but these are fairly incontrovertible, I think. One of the things that I've done is, over the past year, is just endlessly keep trawling through statements, testimonies, public records of the experiences of people who survived the fire. Relatively unmediated statements in the media, social media, and so on. And of course, now from the middle of last week, the testimonies of survivors will start to be made available through the public inquiry. The first witness testimony of a survivor was given last Wednesday at the more big inquiry. So these emotional harms have been documented based on those kind of testimonies, but they're fairly obvious anyway. So survivors have consistently expressed grief at their loss, grief at loss of people, their loved ones, of course, also possessions that can't be replaced. Many of the residents of the tower were born outside England. I think about 48% is the most reliable figure that I've seen. People, I'm not a pet person, people also talk about loss of pets. Actually, it comes up consistently in people's kind of experiences in terms of what they've lost and their grief. Obviously, there's grief through the recall of the horrors of that night, getting out of the building and knowing that others didn't get out. There's guilt at surviving when other people, why did I get out and X, Y, and Z didn't get out. That's a very common expression that one hears. And also in the immediate aftermath, one of the really sensitive things that happened to some of the survivors when the local council eventually started to do something, which was sometime after the fire, was that some people who needed rehousing were rehoused in high-rise accommodation and were immediately re-traumatised by that experience, and so the trauma has been kind of exacerbated. So there are documented increased levels of PTSD, depression, anxiety, self-harm. One charity claimed within 3 months of the fire that there were 20 recorded attempts at suicide amongst people on the wider estate. So we'd expect all of those kinds of things. Then for the broader community, for the survivors and other people on the estate, there was the trauma of the constant visibility of the tower. The tower was eventually wrapped. I think it was wrapped, it was completed in the spring of this, in the summer. Yeah, okay, yeah, around the first anniversary, yeah. So for a long time, people were living with this tower in their midst. It was a kind of on one level it was a crime scene, but people talked about it. People use expressions like a coffin in the sky, a crematorium in the sky. There's one quote that I come across where somebody says, look, every time the wind blows, we're worried. We think we're being covered by the ashes of our friends, our neighbours, our relatives, our loved ones. So the tower was always there, always a reminder, always a traumatising phenomenon for the broader local community. And of course, the anxieties and the harms, the psychological harms produced by the tower also rippled out across the country because many other communities realised that they also lived in high-rise residential accommodation with similar or the same types of cladding. In other words, cladding which was flammable. And you may remember Sajid Javid, the communities minister at the time, now Home Secretary, I think, is he? Anyway, he got a promotion. He must have done a really good job before. Sajid Javid said, and I'll come back to some of these things, he said, look, for people who live in those tower blocks with flammable cladding, expense will be no object, right? We'll kind of remove the cladding and replace it. And of course, expense did prove to be a barrier. So we're now 16 months since the fire. There are 364 high-rise residential buildings which have been identified as needing to have flammable cladding removed from them. Only 24 have had the work completed. 101 have had the work started. So the majority still have the cladding. The people who are in those high-rise residential accommodation, they don't know when the work will start. And of course, they express fears about their vulnerability living in the same kind of physical infrastructure that the residents of Grenfell Tower lived in and ultimately died in. So one of the things I want to say, or I have said in other contexts, is that not only are these harms, they have a temporal quality. In other words, they last for, I think most of these harms last for people, the rest of people's lives, right? Certainly some of those emotional and psychological harms, and some of the physical harms will as well. But the harms also have a geographical rippling out effect, I think. And this is something which has long been identified in, I used to research disasters when I was kind of a much younger person. This is something recognised in disaster research, that disasters have a rippling out effect. And you can kind of see that in terms of, I'm going to talk about Grenfell as disaster, it was an atrocity, it was a killing, but you can see that the effects of what happened and the trauma have spread out across the country to places like Salford, with 32 of these high-rise residential accommodations from which the flammable cladding needs to be removed, by the way. A third form of harm, some of these titles aren't very satisfactory, but hey-ho, the titles aren't really the important thing. But I've used the term cultural harms because I literally mean that. For those people who were in the tower and have been and survived and been relocated, or those people who lived around the tower and who were relocated, and that was some 128 households of people who lived on the broader estate who had to move out of their homes as a result of what happened that morning. Literally, there are accustomed ways of living, the ways of living to which they were acculturated, have been disrupted. You know, their forms of socialising, their forms of relaxation, their forms of leisure, their forms of the ways in which they engage with the social world. All of those things were disrupted in their relocation from their home and from their community. Yeah. So kind of cultural harms, I think, in that sense. And that disruption, that kind of loss of networks, you know, just the kind of the stuff that makes day-to-day life kind of all right. You know, you see the people on the bus on the way to work, or you see the people on the tube, or you see people in the park when you're taking the kind of baby out in the buggy, or down the shops, or in the pub, or in the cafe. All of those kind of just normal things to which you're accustomed were all broken for these people. They lost those networks at a time when they probably needed them most. Yeah? And none of this stuff is really being talked about or documented in terms of the harmful effects of what happened on that night and morning. The other thing, which is very, very clear if you read kind of people's experiences who were relocated into B&B and hotel accommodation on a temporary basis, although about a third of the people who were in the town have been relocated are still in emergency accommodation, but I'll come back to that in a bit as well. It's just, there's two things. The sheer monotony of life in a B&B or life in a hotel. Right? Imagine living in a B&B or a hotel room. I mean, you know, the Daily Mail kind of talks about, oh, it's all right for the Grenfell survivors, they're in a hotel, but you're in a fucking shitty, you're in a room, a 4x4 room, right? But also, these people don't know when they're going to be out of there. So it's the monotony and it's the not knowing. And the monotony and not knowing comes across in both of these quotations. I won't read them out, you can read them for yourselves. But just the kind of, you know, the not knowing and the loss of control and, you know, being in somewhere which isn't your own place, you're not surrounded by your own stuff. You know, you can't cook your own food, you don't have your privacy. In some places you can't even open the window properly if you've ever been in some of those hotels or B&Bs, right? And again, just what amounts to, for many people, a bare existence. And a bare existence which for a third of the households, some 70-odd households, or 68 I think it is, it's still been experienced 16 months after the fire, right? Which I think is pretty scandalous in the fourth largest industrialised economy in the world. There were also a whole series of financial and economic harms associated with what happened with the fire, with what happened that morning and that night and morning. By financial harms, I mean harms to individuals and households. And by economic harms, I mean financial harms experienced beyond the level of the individual household to the local, regional, or national economy. And again, these are kind of fairly obvious once you set them out, but they need to be set out, I think. So, individuals and families and households have experienced a whole series of financial costs, taken a financial hit. They've been relocated. They've probably got more expensive travels to work or to a benefits office or to their GP or to school. Because they've been moved further away from where those things are. They've got costs of eating out, they've got costs of replacing possessions, they've got costs of taking time off work if they're in paid work to attend community meetings, to attend medical appointments, to attend funerals, right? Now, all of those costs may at some point be, and some have been compensated, right? And some may be compensatable, but they're all financial hits which individuals and households have taken in the wake of the fire that day. There were costs of local economies. There was one report by the charity Muslim Aid, I think it was, in around the first anniversary of the fire in June 2018, which estimated that about 80 local businesses had had to shut down because of the change to the physical infrastructure around the town. So there were some very immediate and apparent costs to the local economy. There were costs to the council, of course, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea Council. I mean, the council will eventually have to pay for legal costs and eventually will have to pay some kinds of fines, I've already mentioned, even if it's fire safety legislation. The Lakanal House fire in Southwark in 2009 killed 6 people in very similar circumstances actually to the Grenfell Tower fire, and had the coroner's recommendation to be followed, Grenfell Tower would never have happened. But the Lakanal House fire killed 6 people. On the inquests alone, Southwark Council spent £6.4 million in legal costs, on the inquest alone, not the kind of, it was eventually prosecuted under fire safety legislation. So there'll be considerable costs, legal costs and other costs for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and therefore they'll be passed on, as I said, just like the fine, to the local taxpayers, so the more vulnerable will be hit the hardest. There'll be costs borne by local authorities and the public sector across the country as local authorities replace the cladding, because the government isn't going to stump up the money. It's going to make available £400 million already from a housing funds that will simply move some money around. So councils will lose out in one way or the other. And also to the public sector more generally. It's not just high-rise residential accommodation where cladding needs replacing. So, for example, part of the John Radcliffe Hospital has been closed since a few days after the fire because this part of the hospital is also clad in very similar flammable materials. So those costs will ripple out, spread out across the rest of the country, and there will also be costs to central government. The costs already entailed in the public inquiry, for example, that will run to millions, to at least tens of millions, and perhaps into three figures. And all of those costs to the council, to local authorities, to the public sector in general, to central government, all of those costs ultimately will especially hit those people who are most dependent upon local and central government services. Now, they essentially hit people who have least financial independence, especially hit the poorest and most vulnerable. So you've got a kind of vicious cycle, two different things, but you kind of know what I mean, right? Double fucking whammy, triple whammy, call it what you like. The poor are getting hit hardest by these processes. Not to mention the context of austerity in which all of this is being rolled out. And I won't mention austerity because, of course, after last week it doesn't exist anymore, so we've been told, so that's all right then. I'm kind of coming towards a close. The last set of harms that I want to refer to are again, it's maybe not the best term, it's our harms of recognition. The idea of recognition comes from, well, I particularly associate with a feminist sociologist, Nancy Fraser, and harms of recognition are really refers to intersubjective experiences between people, where some people's experiences of being refused love, being refused rights, being refused esteem, being refused respect, being refused dignity, being refused essentially humanity, not treated as really human compared to some other people. And this is precisely the ways in which the survivors of Grenfell Tower have been treated. They've been treated as if less than human. And in fact, it was that treatment as if less than human which allowed the fire to occur in the first place. Because the residents, and Pilgrim may talk about this because she was helping to organise them, the residents had long pointed out the dangers, the manifest dangers of the ways in which the refurbishment through 2015, 2016 was being carried out in the tower. They documented it through their blogs. Some of them are chilling because they have pictures of the tower burning and saying KCTMO and the council will only listen to us when this happens, when there's a disaster. And of course it turned out to be the case. Stick KCTMO playing with fire into Google and you'll find one of the blogs in the Grenfell Action Group, which is I think the most chilling. But those warnings were ignored because those people didn't count. Those people's voices didn't count. What's more, they didn't count. They didn't count in terms of the people. No, let me go back. It's not hard to imagine, it's impossible to imagine how it must be for a survivor of the fire that night, someone who's lost loved ones or someone who's lost just some possessions or whatever it is, right? Not just possessions. To know that they are in the situation they're in and 72 people have lost their lives and all these other harms have been produced, to know that that happened because the council decided to save £293,000 and switch from a less flammable to a more flammable form of cladding. Cladding which was being put on the outside of the tower, not for any benefit for the residents, but to make it a bit less offensive for the very rich residents of what is actually the richest borough in England, Kensington and Chelsea, the home of the super rich. It's just unimaginable to know what it must feel like to be killed as a result of cost cutting, to be killed as a result of being treated with sheer contempt, to be killed to save £293,000 by a council which in 2016 sold off 2 council houses for a combined figure of £4.5 million. £4.5 million for 2 council houses. A council with the biggest reserves in England. Reserves of nearly £300 million, I think. So contempt caused the fire, and contempt is the way in which the residents have been treated afterwards. That was also manifest in the response of the national and local state, because the response of the national and local state to the fire was nothing. Virtually nothing happened. People on the ground in the estate self-organised. And that's even accepted by a mendacious Prime Minister, Theresa May, who 9 days after the fire stood up in Parliament and apologised for the fact that she said, I want to apologise for the absence of the national and local state at a time when our people needed them most, because they weren't fucking there. They were absent, right? Now, they would have been there if this was in Chelsea, a couple of miles down the road, yeah? They would have been there if it's in Sloane Square, a few miles down the road. They would have been there if it's in the rich parts of Bayswater, but it didn't matter, because this was one of the poorest parts of the country and one of the poorest parts of London. Contempt has also been shown in the whole series of kind of delays in responding to the conditions produced by the fire, promises that were made and broken, half-truths that were told, and lies that have been told to the residents and the survivors, lies about rehousing. Immediately after the fire, our friend Sajid Javid said that everybody would be permanently rehoused within 3 weeks. Then he said, oh, sorry, there'll be an offer of permanent rehousing within 3 weeks. And he said, whoops, fuck me, sorry, I got that wrong. There'll be an offer of temporary accommodation within 3 weeks. A year after the fire, 70 of the displaced households were in permanent accommodation, 68 were in temporary accommodation, and 72 were still in emergency accommodation, bed and breakfast and hotels. And as I say, 128 other households, never counted in these figures, were still in temporary accommodation who'd been displaced, not from the tower itself, but from the housing around. Families were lied to about the chair of the panel. They were lied to about the makeup of the inquiry panel. They were lied to about the terms of reference of the inquiry. The Home Office lied about an amnesty for what it called, in another harmful expression, illegal immigrants who lived in the tower, by which they meant people who didn't have the right to remain permanently in the UK. They lied about an amnesty for those people in terms of allowing them to stay here. And they also lied about funding for cladding removal. The £400 million, which was eventually announced 1 year after the fire, after enormous pressure, it was soon revealed that actually came from an existing budget, the Affordable Homes budget. So it's just 400 million was moved around from one budget for poor people to another budget for poor people. So the contempt, the lack of recognition, the disrespect, which helped produce the fire, has continued since. Okay. So I'm going to finish, say 3 things: truth, accountability and justice. Where does all this leave us? Well, I think truth requires many things. One of the things it requires is that we're able to document and recognise and acknowledge and track through, in some cases even measure, the various harms that have been experienced after Grenfell, produced by Grenfell, and that's one of the things that, in my own small way, which I have tried to and will continue to try to contribute to. We need to know what's happened, all the big picture in terms of what's happened as a result of the fire. And as I've indicated, the kind of harms I've talked about don't really get talked about in general in relation to what's happened since June the 14th, 2017. Accountability, that requires that the guilty men, women and organisations get convicted through the criminal justice system. That's how our legal system delivers accountability. For organisations that might happen, for individuals it won't happen, and where it happens for organisations the outcome will be accountability, but won't be just, because as I say, the fines will end up being paid, displaced to the poor. And I think justice requires truth, it requires accountability, but it also requires much more than that. And we could talk all night, or I couldn't talk all night, but we could collectively talk all night about what justice means, how we define justice and what justice might look like. But I'll just say this and then I'll stop. Most of my working life has been working with families bereaved by deaths at work. And they all say, they say lots of different things, but there's one common thing which they say in terms of what justice looks like. I also work with Joe on the board of a charity called Inquest, who supports families who are bereaved by state killings in custody. And many of the families with which Inquest work also say the same kind of things. And I bet, although I haven't gone nosing round to speaking to them, I don't ever intend to, I bet many of the families who are bereaved by the killing, the social murder that took place at Grenfell will say the same thing too. And they all say a version of this: we don't want another family to go through what we've gone through. They don't want vengeance, they don't want punishment, they want prevention. We don't want another family to go through what we've gone through, consistent from victims of these kinds of atrocities. So that prevention, that simple aim has got to be the goal of our struggles, alongside generating truth and accountability. But that aim, preventing this, is not delivered through criminal justice. It's only delivered through social justice. That must be the focus of our struggles. So I'll finish with the motto of the Hazards campaign, which fights for safer workplaces. And it's this: remember the dead, fight for the living. Thank you very much.
fire and important that the farmers and survivors after the fire as well.
Okay, hello, so I'm Pilgrim Tucker. For the past 16 months I've been working mainly with residents from the estate, the Lancaster West estate, around Grenfell Tower, and mainly working with them in their housing struggles. 2 years before the fire itself, I worked with the Grenfell Tower residents, helping them organise against aspects of the refurbishment that was going on that they could see significant problems with at the time. I'm going to talk mostly today about the struggle for justice since the fire, and looking really, and I think it's sort of probably quite an obvious thing, but I think it needs to be reiterated and said time and time again, how important it is to look at social inequality and the relationship between the state and different institutions and organisations, and how they represent and have acted on behalf of certain sections of society, both prior to the fire, but very obviously since the fire itself. And I thought what I'd do is just go back again and say that this has been 16 months of constant struggle for all of those people who were affected by the fire. And I think this relates to what Steve was talking about harms, because there have been harms exacerbated, extended, compounded by the fact that those people who, and it's no coincidence, come from certain sections of society have had to struggle for every step towards even government and other social institutions acknowledging that they deserve justice. And I think that it slows down other types of recovery, both in very concrete ways when people are homeless and having to fight for their housing. And it exacerbates emotional harms and physical harms. I mean, it's not just that physical harms create emotional harms. Emotional harms and stress is proven to impact on people physically. And I'll give you a couple of examples that I've seen of how that's affected people. I'll talk less about the inquiry because that's something I've not been quite so deeply involved in. But we have to remember there was a fight just to get an inquiry in the first place. There was no immediate acknowledgement by government that there had been wrongdoing, potential criminality, and that an inquiry and justice should be sought from it. That was only after a struggle. That was only after residents had already had to start campaigning to have that recognised. Once the inquiry was granted, there was then another struggle about the scope of that inquiry. And although it was very obvious early on what survivors and other affected people within the community were saying needed to be contained in the scope of that inquiry, there was a struggle had to be had around that. And what I'll go on to talk about in a minute is housing. And housing was, I think, for various sort of quite rational reasons, left out of the scope of that inquiry. There was also a query about who could participate, who would be the core participants in that inquiry. And I was part of the struggle for those residents I've worked most closely with who are in the buildings called the walkways, and they're the low-rise buildings that were built at the same time as Grenfell Tower was built, and they're three buildings that meet the tower. So some of those flats are literally within 20, 30 metres of the tower. So you can see it out of the window their flats, the conditions of their flats were very, very affected by the fire itself. And there was a struggle for those people to have core participant status. There was a struggle for the Residents' Association to have core participant status, and having core participant status is very important because it means you have a solicitor who can feed into the inquiry, and I'll come back to that in a second. There has been a struggle that was only won really quite recently after Stormzy mentioned it when he won a music award, and he explicitly mentioned the petition that survivors and the local community had organised, so that people from the community who understood them and their circumstances and their culture could act as advisors on a panel to the inquiry, which is allowed for in law, and had been argued for by the survivors and their solicitors from day one. But it took a whole long struggle to obtain that. And still, on that same petition, it was asked that the solicitors for the core participants could ask questions of the witnesses, and that still hasn't been granted. And I think those struggles, can under some circumstances empower people, but I think those struggles have been harmful, and I think they've prevented people from recovering. And I think absolutely the struggles around housing have prevented people from recovering, and it's something that all the professionals, certainly the mental health professionals who have been involved there, have said that people can't move on psychologically. They cannot begin to recover if they don't have a stable home where they are secure and where they are safe and where they know they can start to rebuild their lives and look after their children. And so, like I said, I've worked mainly with the residents of the walkways, to a lesser degree with the survivors. And I think it's interesting to look at how the state has been forced to respond by those people organising and galvanising their power under very, very difficult circumstances. So the housing temporary accommodation wasn't automatically granted to survivors of Grenfell Tower. And it absolutely, definitely wasn't granted to the people who weren't able to inhabit their homes, who didn't live in the tower, but who lived in those 3 walkway blocks, who had had their houses flooded, had been evacuated on the night for their own safety, and also so the emergency services could carry out the rescue, but had all had no gas, no hot water, had clear debris from the fire, all over their external buildings. The inside of the buildings had been flooded with water, and every single stage of them trying to get a decent habitable home space has been a fight, and that fight is still going on, and we're at the last part of that fight now. And where we are with the rehousing situation is from the tower and walkway, out of a total of 204 households, so the tower, the walkway looked directly on to the tower, there are 124 people now in a permanent home. I mean, remembering that there was that ridiculous announcement that they would be found permanent homes within a few weeks of the fire itself. And to me, that just demonstrated how distant and how ignorant of the real situation of housing that actual government ministers are, to believe that was achievable, to make such a promise that they have no intention of meeting. Of those 204, 124 are in permanent homes, 37 are in temporary accommodation, and 43 are in hotels. So there's still 80 people in temporary accommodation. Now, most of those have accepted permanent homes, but those permanent homes have not been made ready. And that's actually partly to do with privatisation of state and government functions that I'll come back to in a minute. From the walkways, only 2 people have been offered permanent homes. There were 130 households who didn't return immediately after the initial evacuation. 52 of those, a lot of money has now been put into refurbishing and doing repair work on that estate, and it had been terribly, terribly neglected. And that has been through struggle, and it's been through these people. The government has been forced to appease that section of the community, and you can break the community out into kind of like sort of radiating circles outwards of the tower of who is affected and who has the government been forced into having to recognise. Of those 130 households, 52 have now gone home, and that has been partially because money has been put into the estate and their homes have been made habitable, where they were in very poor condition before. There's 72 in temporary accommodation and 5 still in hotels. Now, what's happening literally this week is that, and this is a repeat of what's happened before, but this is the hardest part, these people are the most forgotten, and the media glare has now gone, and it's much harder to pull it back and focus on those people, and that's very important to do because it's only public pressure that is making the government act. At least 30, and this is according to local government officers, there are at least 30 who cannot go home for physical or psychological reasons. If they were to go home, it would be impossible for them to function because of the level of trauma that they faced. And a lot of those 30 families will be families who lived directly looking onto that tower and watched it from their windows. And so what's happening now is this deadline has been extended, pushed and fought for again and again and again. What happened now was on the 30th of September, the local authority finally said, we're not accommodating you anymore in your temporary accommodation at our cost, really. You will now be, if you want to stay in your temporary accommodation, you will be liable for the full cost of your temporary accommodation, which won't necessarily be covered by housing benefit. And many of these people, and all of the people I'm going to mention to you, actually, are not reliant on housing benefit. So the costs of that are very, very high. You will also now have to start paying your full rent for your accommodation on the Lancaster West estate. But you have to make a choice. And if you don't decide to go home now, we're going to make you relinquish your tenancy with no compensation, no security about your future housing security at all whatsoever. So you are there, you are stuck in temporary accommodation. They are also saying we are moving you from the emergency standard of accommodation to standard council temporary accommodation, which means that those people who are in OK accommodation at the moment are now going to be asked to move again to accommodation that they don't even know what standard it is. And they've said we will start taking, it was a hard deadline. The only concession they made was to turn it from a hard deadline into a soft deadline. But they will start eviction proceedings against people, and they will start making them financially liable from the 30th of September for both costs of both accommodation. So there's Zainab. Oh, right, no, she's fine. She's been public, and she unfortunately may have to do again. So she is a woman who is caring for her husband, and what I was going to say is the way that the other social factors aside from class, such as race and sex, you can see that and how they play into how people are affected and how people are responded to in this situation. So all the people I'm going to mention to you are women, and they are all primary carers. And I think when it comes to housing, that's a very, very important thing to look at and remember. So Zainab has 4 children She runs her own business. She can't move too far out of the area because she needs to run her laundrette in Notting Hill. Her husband, the whole family are incredibly traumatised. I was traumatised just from working with her at the year anniversary. It was awful to see what she was going through. She can't return to her flat. I went back to her flat with her, and she can't go back there. Her husband's physically ill. The whole family are traumatised. They lost their grandfather. The children lost their grandfather in the fire. He lived in the tower. And he lived with their aunts and uncles in that flat. So they are also very, very deeply affected. The council has said, we can't accommodate you, basically. There are not enough flats at a size that you can be accommodated in. Only 2 families out of this group of people have been offered permanent accommodation. Day before yesterday, I got an email from the Law Centre trying to get media attention, and it's harder and harder to get now, about a woman who I actually think she was a Grenfell, it didn't specify, but it seemed as if she was a Grenfell resident, and she had been offered accommodation which was not fit for human habitation. But when she refused it, she was threatened with eviction, despite the fact that the local councillor and the Law Centre were both in dialogue with the local authority, advocating on her behalf, and said she would be making herself intentionally homeless. Another woman is 70 years old. Since they were moved out of, she lives with her 90-year-old mother, and since they were moved out of their flat that they have lived in for decades in the walkways, and that they loved, they're lovely flats. They were built in the 70s to a really high standard, those walkways blocks. Her mother's mental and physical health has depreciated. She's got dementia and other physical disabilities, and they have got so much worse, she is physically not able now to access her home. They need a 2-bedroom flat. They have not been offered a 2-bedroom flat, and they are now being threatened. There's others. I mean, some of the financial costs, somebody I know who's in a slightly better situation, who has been given local authority, social housing association rather than private sector temporary accommodation. That still incurs higher costs to her, and she now faces a cost. She's a lone parent again. Her extra cost for her taking her child to school is £100 a month, and she can't afford that. It's interesting to see the different sections of the state working well and less well. The mental health services that have been provided by the NHS aren't adequate, but there's generally a consensus amongst those affected that the will and the intention and the commitment from NHS workers has been far, far, far better than those in the local authority. And this is essentially, it's a class issue, and it's an economic and it's a financial issue, and those issues were what caused the fire. The same processes over decades of neoliberalism, privileging particular sectors of society to the detriment and in explicit opposition to the less powerful sections of society. The reason that there aren't enough homes now affordable is because of the mass privatisation of council housing. The reason that the local authority housing body wasn't accountable was because of the arm's length arrangements, the mimicking of private sector arrangements that's fixed and still fixed in neoliberal ideology, and that they are still pushing, even in the Green Paper, the Housing Green Paper, which was excluded from the terms of reference of the public inquiry. And they announced that they would have an inquiry into housing and have a Green Paper instead. Well, finally, and people kept asking, where is it? Even in that Green Paper, they're extending right to buy. Some councils who have found a sort of fairly innovative way to build homes had set up bodies called, usually they're called housing development vehicles. And one of the benefits that councillors said was of this type of setup was that there wasn't the right to buy, wasn't available, so they could build houses and they would stay as social housing. Well, in the Green Paper it's proposed that right to buy is extended into those homes that councils are finally being found a way to build. They're using the term community to further remove the state from housing. So they're saying, another proposal was, we will set up community sort of development trusts, community-owned vehicles, and we will transfer housing out of the state and local authority controlled into these new community. Now these are untested. I know one has worked very, very well, but they're untested. Nobody knows what happens if those bodies get into financial trouble at some point in the future. And what's happened is this, and it's interesting listening to this idea of harms of recognition, because I think in terms of what's happened is that in terms of people's democratic recognition, in terms of the recognition of their rights and their voice, they have been de-recognised. And that's patently manifested here in these people's struggles for housing, struggles for the ability just to move on with their lives. And that's it, really. There shouldn't be a struggle for housing. It's just a struggle to be able to go forward in your life. Because you can't look after your children properly if you're in terribly stressed social circumstances, and this will exacerbate people's mental and physical and cultural, if you like, situations, really to their detriment. And it is only through social struggle that these people will find justice on the levels that really, really count. And a state that ameliorated harm in the post-war consensus, a state that the remnants of which now in the NHS are working, the residents say, working well for them. Those were all achieved after a period of struggle, and working class people gaining their power through trade union action and through civil society action, through rent strikes, for instance, but through working class people recognising their class and being conscious of that and conscious that they needed to organise. And what we are seeing here is completely the manifestation of that being destroyed over the past 30 or 40 years, and how that very, very much has manifested in people's physical, real, material well-being and situations and circumstances. Like Steve said, we don't know what the consequences are. I mean, I know people who have on that estate who have been closely involved in this and very much affected, who've suddenly developed illnesses, and that may be coincidental and that maybe would have happened anyway. But who knows how we will try and measure that. But I'm going to stay involved and I'm going to try and measure it. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Well, thanks for organising this, Joe, and to Katie and Kim for organising this as well. Look, I want to talk about something that happened just over 30 years ago as a way into thinking about some of the issues that have been touched on in Grenfell Tower. And a lot of you in this room will be excused for not having heard of the Piper Alpha disaster. Some of you will have. The reason I don't think you'll be excused for having heard of it is because we don't talk about it very much. It happened in 1988, on July the 6th, 1988, so 30 years ago. And I think there are some really crucial lessons that we have to learn from that fire, which killed 167 people, that resonate with Grenfell Tower. And so partly what I want to say is about recovering that memory of what happened in an oil rig in the middle of the North Sea, 130 miles off Aberdeen, and to say, look, this is part of almost precisely the same conditions that we understand, that we can understand what happened at Grenfell Tower. I mean, in a way, I have got this at the forefront of my mind because I came down here in the mid-90s to study, to do a PhD on safety and organisation in the offshore oil industry. Steve was my PhD student. Happened actually, this is another reason why you'd be excused for not knowing about Piper Alpha. Steve was one of only three sociologists in the country even bothered to write about it or to reflect on what was the biggest industrial disaster in 150 years of British history. So. One of the things I think about when I think back to that, and I lived in Aberdeen when Piper Alpha happened, and one of the things that was very, very obvious living there and meeting people, and I remember that the day after, actually, the same day that Armand Hammer, the chief executive officer of the oil company Occidental that caused the disaster, was taking tea in number 10 Downing Street with Margaret Thatcher. I'll come back to that. I remember going out and for a drink with my mate Stuart, and we met someone whose cousin had been on the Piper Alpha. And then as the weeks kind of unfolded, you realise actually that you know people who have a connection. And by the way, a lot of the people who worked and who died some were from Liverpool, some were from Newcastle, and from around the country, but obviously a lot from that local area. And in talking to people and the anger that people had, nobody was talking about an accident. Nobody was really even talking about a disaster. People were talking about a crime, because they knew very clearly that this was avoidable and that there were very clear reasons for why 167 people had been killed on Piper Alpha. And people were talking, they might not have been using the phrase political economy. Before I knew that, before people like Steve and Joe introduced me to the phrase political economy, people were talking about the political economy of those deaths. And by that I just very simply mean the way politics works through economy and the way economy works through politics. And I think that's something that we're losing, and the public discussion about Grenfell is losing. Look, people knew that this was a political economy because partly actually the story that you heard was that it probably wouldn't have been Piper Alpha. People did say there was going to be a major multi-fatality accident in the North Sea, that there was going to be workers who died in a major incident. Actually, they were predicting it would be on other platforms, not on that platform. They knew that there was something about the industry that was creating precisely those risks. And I want to talk about four features of that. And this is partly based on something I wrote. I wrote a blog piece in Open Democracy on the 30th anniversary of Piper Alpha, making the connections between Grenfell and Piper Alpha last July. But I'm trying to kind of extend that analysis a bit more. I think we can think about three features of the conditions of that political economy that are really important. The first one, a kind of political shock therapy. That's what we saw in the background to Grenfell Tower. It's what we saw in the background to Piper Alpha. And that's manifested in different ways. First of all, it's manifested in terms of an almost complete absence of control or oversight or regulation over some areas of safety. In the context of Piper Alpha, more than 100 oil platforms, drilling rigs and production platforms in the northern sector. There were 4 inspectors to inspect the safety on those platforms. They had to arrange to have a helicopter flight out to the platform that was paid for by the oil company, so they knew they were coming anyway. And even when they got there, they were working for the Department of Energy, which was the same department that was encouraging maximum production of oil on behalf of the British state, so they knew they were powerless to do anything. The other aspect was actually most of the protections, worker protections that applied in the onshore industries that Pilgrim kind of noted that people fought hard for over decades and decades, didn't apply on the offshore industry. It was an understanding actually that regulation gets in the way of profits, and the oil industry had to be producing profits because the oil industry came along at a time that was absolutely crucial for the British exchequer. So political economy, the way politics works through economy, the way economy works through politics, and you can see that Grenfell Tower, almost precisely the same kind of rationale. Business is being interfered with. There's a burden on business when you regulate too much. Regulation gets in the way of profits. And we all, I'm sure people here know some of the examples. I think actually one of the key examples was introduced by the Blair government, the Labour government, in one of the, I think, more kind of obvious examples in 2005, when they effectively privatised the regulation of fire safety. They took the responsibility for fire safety certificates away from local fire services and allowed private consultants to do that, allowed landlords to arrange that for themselves. And in fact, when the fire safety certificate was prepared for Grenfell Tower, we know that the advice from the person who was employed to issue the certificate was, you don't have to tell the council about this. You don't even have to notify under the law what the issues are that were raised in this particular process of certification. The permitted use of desktop studies that some of you may have heard of, that's been a kind of creeping thing, but certainly since 2014 it's been a routine way of testing fire safety. You don't actually test in real practical experiments. You use desktop studies, so you use computer modelling or you use some other kind of modelling, and certainly that we know still that's on the agenda. So the approved document B, which is the regulation which applies, is still out for consultation. It's still open whether those desktop studies will apply or not, despite the fact that they've been implicated in the testing of the cladding. More recently, when the Shadow Housing Minister Theresa Pearce proposed a pretty modest amendment to the 2016 Housing and Planning Act, that tenants should be allowed to take landlords to court for substandard housing, it was rebuffed and rejected in Parliament by the Housing Minister Brandon Lewis, and I'm quoting, because it would impose further unnecessary regulation on landlords. So that rationale, that idea that regulation has to be stripped back, has to be removed because it's a burden on business, it gets in the way of profits, has actually been the dominant approach to regulation probably for 3 decades now, and the culmination of that is what I'm describing. The phrase "the bonfire of red tape," we don't hear that actually repeated. In fact, it's not been said. It's not a phrase that you would hear since June 2017. It's not a phrase that Tory ministers talk about now with the frequency that they used to. It has a chilling significance now. But that's the bonfire of red tape. And we also see, as part of this political, I would call political shock therapy, in terms of the regulatory conditions in Grenfell Tower, an intensification of what Steve's talked about in his work, and Steve and I in other work, of privatisation of regulation. It's very clear that not only in the context of the fire safety regulations, but also in the context of the building safety regulations, that you've got a privatisation of those regulatory authorities. So the regulatory authorities now that have the key advisory decisions and are even doing the key tests on things like cladding are private organisations. They're not public regulators anymore. BRE Global, which is a contract with the Department of Communities and Local Government to investigate issues that have implications for building regulations, was the private regulator which said in April 2016 there's no need to change the cladding regulations because they're adequate. What happened after the Grenfell Tower fire? Well, the government appointed an expert advisory panel to look at the cladding, and there were 2 people from BRE Global on that independent advisory panel. So that privatisation of regulation runs directly through the system. You could go almost to the kind of the ridiculous level. I'm not articulating a conspiracy theory here. I'm articulating a political economy, but you would be excused for thinking that there is a conspiracy here in terms of some of the connections that we can uncover. Another key government advisor on regulation, which initiates advice on regulatory change, is called the Building Regulations Advisory Committee. At the time of the fire, there was a guy called Mark Allen, who's the technical director of Saint-Gobain, French company, which owns Cellutex, which is the company that's been under the spotlight as the manufacturer of the cladding. Mark Allen was on this committee which was advising the government on those regulatory standards. I mean, you couldn't kind of make this up. Another aspect of this privatisation of regulation was in 2015 the abolition of the Audit Commission. The Audit Commission, I'm not saying it did a great job, I happen to think it didn't do a particularly good job, but it was a public authority that was charged with auditing local authority finance and local authority activities. It was abolished, and it was abolished to create a huge market for the big four accounting firms. Well, now you've got the accounting firm KPMG, who are auditing, not only auditing Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, they're also auditing Ryden, the main contractor that did the work on Grenfell Tower, that's under, as Steve noted, is probably under investigation at the moment. But it also is the auditor for Cellutex, the company that manufactured the cladding. So if that's not a conflict of interest within a privatisation, a privatised regulatory sphere, then I don't know how much further that could go. Another aspect of this political shock therapy that was very clear, I think, and you know, Piper Alpha, what happened in the run-up to Piper Alpha was because of all of the lack of regulation I was talking about, the lack of inspection. There was 4 guys hitchhiking rides on helicopters across the North Sea to try and keep a track on what was going on, and then they weren't enforcing the regulations anyway. Well, one of the consequences of that was that oil companies were pretty much free to do what they wanted in terms of maintaining their equipment, or indeed what happened on the Piper Alpha was a constant series of additions to the plant equipment which speeded up production and which expanded the production capacity way beyond its ability to maintain production safely. This has been documented in the public inquiry. There happened to be more than 3 sociologists, more engineers than the 3 sociologists who were working afterwards on analysing the Piper Alpha disaster, and that was their analysis. The company cut maintenance budgets and at the same time pushed the capacity of production to its maximum limits. So there's a lack of control on capital investment and the way capital investment is being applied. And if that sounds like a very kind of technical term, I think we need to think about that in terms of Grenfell Tower. I'm going to give a couple of examples. When Ryden, the contractor I just mentioned, the lead contractor on the refurbishment, it's fairly well established now. When it got the contract, it got the contract because it undercut the original contractor. It undercut the original contractor by about £2.5 million. So it's not insignificant. And in fact, some of the costs that Steve referred to, of course, were costs that were cut back on the quality of the cladding, but on a whole series of other things. The famous urgent nudge email that went from the TMO to the cost contractor Artelia, we need good costs for Councillor Fielding Mellon and the planner tomorrow at 8:45 a.m. So even after they undercut the original bids, that wasn't enough. They had to cut it again and keep cutting the costs on the bid. So there's no control here over the relationship between capital investment and safety, apart from a logic of cutting costs as low as you can go. And I think that was 293,000 that Steve mentioned, that an investigation by no other radical journal than the Times revealed was probably had direct consequences for the cladding. So, in what I've just said, and I know I took quite a long time to say it, I think we have to see this as a kind of form of political shock therapy. It's not just that companies are responsible, private organisations are responsible for not heeding safety, but they're encouraged to do so by politicians, they're encouraged to do so by the local authority in the case of Grenfell Tower, or by the Department of Energy in the case of Piper Alpha. Another aspect of those kind of conditions that's important is the dominance of subcontracting as a model, and I think we don't recognise this enough as being absolutely central to neoliberalism. In Piper Alpha, probably 15% of the employees were directly employed by the company Occidental. Now the consequences of that was effectively they were subcontractors and could be hired and fired at will. We have the same system effectively, although the big building companies say they don't operate that system now, they effectively do. If there isn't somebody in an office somewhere physically operating a blacklist, there effectively is a blacklist of trade unionists, of people who talk too loudly and so on. That was there very, very strongly in the pre-Piper Alpha industry. I have to say it's still, to the industry's shame, it still exists, although it's maybe not so formalised. So subcontracting allowed that power to be exerted absolutely over any worker who complained, or anyone actually who could have warned about what was happening. And subcontracting was the model for Grenfell Tower, and that brings us to the third point that we've already heard from Steve, which is the extreme concentration of power over safety decisions means that ordinary people who are living through these conditions are just dismissed out of hand, whether it's workers on Piper Alpha, and there were not only a series of warnings in the months and weeks leading up to Piper Alpha that were ignored, and in the past people had been sacked for raising safety issues. There were reports of gas leaks on the day of the disaster that were ignored. It's very, very clear that blog that Steve mentioned, Playing with Fire. If you Google it, you'll see a warning of a serious threat of a loss of life, and that was very clearly ignored through an extreme concentration of power over key decisions that affect people's lives. I think there's a more chilling aspect to this, which is how some of those features combined to affect the chances actually of people surviving, or the way in which the conditions of the fire itself developed. So in those blogs, in those Grenfell Action Group blogs, there is a discussion of the failure of the ventilation system. There is a discussion of the lack of a sprinkler system. There is a discussion of the kinds of things that I'm not saying would have avoided or necessarily prevented serious loss of life, but may well have made a difference to the survivability of, or the chances of surviving what happened. Certainly that was the case in Piper Alpha. Piper Alpha, exactly the same thing happened. There was a sprinkler system, it wasn't maintained, it failed, it was blocked, parts of it weren't working properly. Some other safety critical parts of the plant, lighting, wasn't working because it hadn't been tested properly. Aspects that you would take for granted, like where you go to when there is a fire, or the instructions you're given when there is a fire, completely failed in Piper Alpha. The workers were told to go and muster in what was probably the most dangerous part of the plant. The second, if Steve's the first sociologist, the second sociologist to write about this, Chris Wright, wrote a really interesting analysis where he said the majority of people who survived the Piper Alpha disaster were people who didn't obey the official safety instructions. And that's because there was no account taken of the political economy, of the extreme concentration of power over safety decisions, and of the complete lack of any regard for spending money or making adequate provision for safety. Where they mustered was in an accommodation block. It was made partly of fiberglass, partly of wood, and in a prototype for the Piper Alpha, the accommodation block had actually burned down in the Gulf of Mexico. People were told to muster there. It became, and it was situated above some of the most flammable parts of the plant, and it became the most dangerous place to be. Now, I don't know about the advice that people were given on the night of the Grenfell fire, and I know that's an issue for the public inquiry. But I have to say, when I saw, and certainly the fire service is not, you know, the Fire Brigade Union has already said there are serious questions that the fire service have to answer. But I have to say, if people died in Grenfell Tower because they followed the official safety advice, it wouldn't be out of character for those kind of events. That's certainly what happened in Piper Alpha, because what's happening there is a system of cost-cutting, a system of complete disregard for safety is rendering the normal safety procedures completely meaningless. And that is a big aspect of the way in which voices are ignored and people are ignored in that sense. So, I think that political economy that I've kind of tried to discuss here is significant, and it might still seem a bit odd that I'm linking one event which happened 30 years ago and this event, but I think it's absolutely crucial for developing accountability, because that political economy itself masks the possibility of accountability. And I'm thinking about one aspect of that. I'm going to go through about 5, but the first aspect, subcontracting. The chain of subcontracting masks accountability. In the case of Piper Alpha, what happened was Occidental paid out some compensation. We don't know how much because it was all bound by confidentiality agreements, but they made a big noise about it. And then in 1992, Occidental decided to take the contractors to court, 26 contractors, and they decided to take even one of the individual survivors to court to recover some of the costs that they paid out in compensation. They blamed what had happened on the subcontracting chain. Now, that's what I mean when I say that subcontracting chain can mask and distort accountability. Not only that, the guy that I ended up getting to know a bit later on, Bob Ballantyne, he was dragged. He was given a legal order to appear in front of the High Court in Edinburgh to relive his experience that night 4 years before, just as he was recovering from the psychological effects or trying to go through a recovery process. So not only did they drag people up to recover the money, but they dragged people up to recount the horrors of what they'd been going through so they could recover that money. Who knows if that kind of thing is going to happen in the context of Grenfell Tower? But one thing we do know is that the subcontracting chain, the long subcontracting chain, who knows how many people, how many organisations and how many companies it involves. Counts have varied between 8 and 17. I think there's many more once you start factoring in who was subcontracting what to who, and we don't actually know. That's one of the points. But just thinking about the panels, thinking about the cladding panels, Arconic, who supplied the panels, when they were asked about their responsibility, I'm directly quoting from their news release. It was not our role to decide what was or was not compliant with local building regulations. Omnis, who cut the panels, said, we played no part in the selection of Reno Bond PE, the material they used, and simply fulfilled the order as directed by the design and build team. Harley Facades that you might have come across a big question as well, who fitted the panels. The cladding used in the development was as billed in the contract. Artelia mentioned before, the cost, overall cost contractor who suggested the cost cutting. It was not our role to look at the design of the project or specification and or approval of the materials. This is the aspect of subcontracting that we need to recognise. It's not just there to save costs at every stage. That's the first reason it's there. The second reason it's there is to enable a system of plausible deniability, to blur accountability. And that's a crucial aspect, a lesson we have to take. I have to say the chain of ownership, which is different, and we could talk for a long time about the complex different forms of ownership that some of the companies I've mentioned have taken. But Celotex, the company I've mentioned a couple of times, look, it's owned by a multinational, as I mentioned, in France. If you look at the structure of Saint-Gobain, the company and Saint-Gobain deals in engineering, building materials and building sales, and it branches out into other spheres, right? If you begin to go into company's house and start to research the structure of the Saint-Gobain companies, you find some very interesting things. You find that there are interlocking directorships amongst quite a number of their companies. I'm going to name one that you might have heard of, Jewson. You know Jewson, the building. You know, about 10 years ago they had a TV advert. Yeah. So Jewson has a close directorship relationship with Celotex. There is an interlocking directorship. They're both owned by Saint-Gobain. So what, you might say? Well, what that means to me is the company is organising itself in a way in which it can, for whatever reason, it might be for any number of reasons. I'm not going to speculate. It could be for whatever reason. It's fragmenting itself into a number of separate, discrete organisations, but it's still part of the same whole. It's still part of the same thing. I'm going to come back to that because Saint-Gobain have not, as the overall holding company, have not suffered or have not been affected in any way by the Grenfell Tower fire, partly because it's able to organise itself in that complex ownership structure. Another example, which again gets you back into thinking, bloody hell, am I a conspiracy theorist again or not? No, it's not conspiracy, it's political economy. Collar Capital is a private equity firm, owns about a fifth of Ryden, the main contractor. The founder and the boss of Collar Capital is a guy called Jeremy Collar, who in the past was who made major donations to the Tory party. We know he made £15,000 donation in July 2015. So those complex structures of ownership are also crucial in terms of masking accountability. How much time do I have? Okay. I do want to say, I mean, both Pilgrim and Steve have said a lot about the local authority and about the role of the local authority. I don't know if anyone saw this on Monday. Cambridge University published interesting research about the depth of the impact of austerity cuts on local authorities. It was in the papers on Tuesday. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, the richest borough in the country, is the 10th. It's 10th on the league table of the local authorities that have cut the most. It's cut 38% of its budget in 8 years. It's the richest. It's got the biggest reserves. We've just heard that from both our speakers. So, first thing I want to say here is there's a self-imposed austerity. It's another feature of how the political economy is masking accountability, and I'm going to set out exactly what I mean by that. They voted to slash, 2010, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea voted to slash council tax. And the way they did it was they produced an annual efficiency dividend. I mean, they think they're operating like a private company here. That's what they think they're doing. And that's clearly how they can be so aggressive and violent in the way they're treating the survivors, as we've just said. They think they're behaving like a private company. an efficiency dividend. That efficiency dividend went to people who paid their council tax in lump sums, and it went to people only, exclusively, who are paying full council tax. That efficiency dividend was a rebate to the richest residents of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And how was it paid for? Not out of the almost 300 million reserves that Steve mentioned, no. It was paid through cuts to their services. I'm going to list some of this. This, by the way, is from Joe Benjamin of Research Action. He did the work to uncover this. In terms of their housing budget, 81% cut. In terms of their their planning budget, 81%, housing budget, 76%, and regulatory services, 22%. This is a council that doesn't have to cut anything, but it's cutting. It's using that political discourse of austerity to punish. We know who the victims are when you cut the housing budgets, when you cut the regulatory budgets. Again, as to echo Pilgrim, punishing the poor. And actually, if you look at its most recent financial statement, it's neutral. It's not dipping into its reserves to deal with some of the issues that clearly need to be dealt with that we've just heard. But it does make a statement that it's dipped into its reserves to pay for some of the costs that Pilgrim talked about of housing people, right? It makes that explicit statement, but it's clearly trying to limit it, even though it has the money. So it's not just that it's evicting people, refusing people housing, it has the money to house people. This is self-imposed austerity. This is a self-imposed political economy. So the austerity economy continues and it masks accountability. The bonfire of red tape, even though we don't hear the phrase, has not been interrupted. The most recent assessment of fire safety audits, about 60,000 fire safety audits. That's a significant decrease, by about 15,000 over the last couple of years. 60,000 fire safety audits done on 1.5 million buildings the fire authorities know are subject to the law. There's a big gap. Nobody knows actually if they're being audited under the law or not. We do know of those 60,000, 30% are failing those audits, those fire safety audits. But we don't know how those are being dealt with because the regulation, as I implied earlier, changed the conditions and it changed the basis for how and when and who you have to report. So, the bonfire of red tape continues, and we all live in places where there are less regulators. We all work in places where we have almost no chance of being visited by a health and safety inspector. We all live near places where there's a significant decline in regulatory inspection. If you're talking about the Environment Agency, we're talking about probably about 46% cut in budget since 2010, and the Health and Safety Executive is closely following behind. So that continuation of the bonfire of red tape through the austerity economy is continuing. And the last thing I want to say is that and it masks accountability. That's the clear thing. Another thing that's being masked here is actually if we follow the money. And I never expected the public inquiry to be following the money. In a way, that's what all of us have been doing in different ways, right? But we have to follow the money if we have to understand what accountability means in this sense. I'm going to read out 3 public announcements by 3 companies that I've already mentioned today. 8th of March, Ryden announced a rise on profits of 50%. Now that's to September 2017, so it doesn't include the whole period. But I will say this, in the same statement, Ryden said they were making no provision for costs associated to Grenfell. They're expecting no prosecution and fine. They're expecting that they won't have to pay out anything in terms of supporting the victims, or they're certainly making no provision for that. 24th of May, Artelia, the cost contractor, announced its 6th successive year of growth, with turnover rising more than 10% last year. July 26th, Saint-Gobain, that I mentioned. Celotex have been the company probably most under the spotlight, so the owners of Celotex said that operating profits had edged up from the year before to now 1.47 billion euros. So in that sense, the bonanza economy that we could talk about a lot more, which stands behind this, the bonanza economy which has exploited ordinary people in London and has created extreme profiteering from the housing market, from shifting public housing into the private sector, from tax breaks for private landlords, and from actually no controls over capital flows in to purchase houses and property in the housing market. That bonanza economy remains intact and accountability is masked. So I think what we have to say as well, if we flip that on its head in turn, those state forms of accountability, or the lack of accountability that we've heard from both Steve and Pilgrim, are at the same time masking those aspects of the political economy. If there is a corporate manslaughter prosecution, it won't get anywhere near the subcontracting economy. It won't get anywhere near, in fact by definition it won't get anywhere near the complex chains of ownership. It certainly won't get behind them to the real people who are profiting behind those economies. The public inquiry is not going anywhere near the political economy. So the public inquiry is also masking accountability through the political economy. And I think that's one thing that we have to we have to recognise that, of course, the public inquiry is only happening, and it's only happening on that basis because there was a struggle. If there is a corporate manslaughter prosecution, it will only happen because there has been a struggle. But it still won't mean that we've changed anything substantial that would prevent another neoliberal fire like this happening again. And in that sense, to come back to almost a kind of, we're in a critical criminology department here, and one thing that you will hear a lot as students, or the people who teach in the audience will talk about the way the state absorbs conflicts and then it repackages those conflicts in ways that are palatable. And I think that's something that we have to be very careful of. No matter what happens in the public inquiry, no matter what happens in the prosecution, if there is a prosecution, the problems lie much deeper. They lie in the political economy. And I'll leave it there.